out there, and this would have been about 5 years ago, that was actually doing it. When Jill began talking about what she was doing, she clearly had my very rapt interest in what she was doing. And so when I joined the high school center, I proposed to Joe, I said, Joe, I think what we ought to do, given that there's really no research to draw from at the high school level, I think we ought to go out and look at RTI in high schools around the country, and see what we can, first of all, how is it manifesting itself? Exactly what are they doing, and what can we learn from it? So today's presentation really is about that endeavor. As it turned out, this endeavor, when we undertook it, we had a great collaboration between three national centers. The high school center, the Center on Instruction that Christy is representing, and the National Center on Response to Intervention. And so our goal then was to enhance, both to understand how tier intervention models were emerging and to help kind of enhance broader understanding of that. And hopefully today we can do some of that for you. Our approach to this was to identify high schools around the country that were implementing tiered interventions, or RTI, and we did that through a kind of a nomination process where we used the comprehensive centers funded by the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education, the regional resource centers funded by the Office of Special Ed Programs, and state agencies. And in the end, we ended up contacting 51 high schools that had been nominated, and following that ended up doing a fairly extensive interview with 20 high schools, and we put together kind of a blue ribbon panel of a technical advisory group that advised us, and then in the end conducted 8 site visits to high schools. And the site visits were quite extensive and, as it turned out, very important to understand what was going on. Because I think in some of the phone interviews that we did, that some of what we learned was probably more what the school hoped to be doing, aspired to do. And when we went on site, it became clear some of these things they weren't yet doing. They no doubt reflected what they wanted to be doing, but they weren't there yet. And the site visits really illuminated that, and I think helped us understand much better kind of the process and struggles that schools were engaged with as they were implementing. Kind of a word about what is response intervention, and this is drawn actually from a document from the National Center on Response Intervention. It's an essential elements document. And response intervention integrates assessment and intervention within a multi-level prevention system to maximize student achievement and to reduce behavior problems. And in a lot of RTI work, people forget to mention the behavior problems, but yesterday we had a great presentation on positive behavior supports interventions, and that is another example of a good example of an RTI approach to addressing problem behaviors. Most of the work that we're doing in the National RTI Center is really focused more on the instruction side and not so much on the behavior side, largely because there is a PBI center to do to focus on problem behaviors. Everybody by now is there anybody in here that has never seen this triangle? Yeah, I think that by now probably everybody has seen this. Lucille Eber, who presented on PBS yesterday, had a nice one because it had on the left side, it had the kind of RTI focused on academic outcomes, and on the right side, it had the behavior, which probably is the thing we should be doing to really emphasize both aspects of it. What's important in this is it reflects the kind of the tiered nature of RTI. That is, there's what we do for all kids, sometimes referred to as core instruction, and the percentages here are kind of what you might call more averages, and depend a little bit on kind of where you are. I mean, you shouldn't necessarily think that, and I've heard instances where these percentages get applied in almost like this is the way it has to be. and that we have to have 15% of kids in a Tier 2 intervention. Well, not necessarily. And I can give you actually one example where that probably would not be the case, is that if you are in a school district with a very large population of free and reduced lunch kids, and these are kindergarten kids, it would surprise me if you had just 15% of kids who were receiving Tier 2 instruction in reading, for example. Now, as you move along in grades, though, I would expect even in that school that by third or fourth grade, you might be aiming to have something much closer to the 15%, even in a school like that. So this reflects then the notion of the tiers of intervention, and that kids who the assumption is that kids who don't respond to high quality core instruction would receive then high quality secondary intervention. And one of the things that is often said is that this notion of high quality or evidence-based instruction is really important because, again, is that if you don't have high quality instruction, again, your percentages are not going to look like this. And so, if you get lots of kids requiring Tier 2 or Tier 3 intervention, it may be an indication that you need to be looking at the fidelity of implementation of of these higher tiers, that is, of the primary or secondary intervention. We've got this slide, and you'll see in our documents discussion about these key principles of RTI. And one of the things that necessitated this, and it was basically reflects discussions that we ended up having among the collaborating centers, is that after we returned from the site visits and we began to have discussion is what some of these high schools implementing, is it RTI? I mean, one of the things that's kind of important to keep in mind is for most of us, our notion of what RTI is very much an artifact of what RTI looks like in elementary schools, and where there, particularly if the focus is on literacy, where there's a large body of research to draw from. It typically will focus on all kids. There will be widely available secondary interventions in reading that are available that are evidence-based. There are screening tools that have been rigorously developed, progress monitoring tools that have been rigorously developed, and there's a lot that's kind of there. At the high school level, and you'll hear more of this as Christy talks, so I'm not going to say too much about it, but at the high school level, the programs are sometimes very narrowly focused. They sometimes may be only focused on, there was one of the schools we talked about, it was only focused on homework completion. And this was based on some problem solving that focused on, beginning focus was initially on course failures in ninth grade. And all of you probably would know why somebody would be interested in course failures in ninth grade. And so that problem solving then led them back to a focus on homework. And this would be probably very odd for an elementary school to have somebody focus that narrowly, but is not so unusual for high schools. And so that kind of challenged us to think a little bit more broadly about RTI and at the high school level, what are really the critical features of RTI? And so the framework of RTI, with its emphasis on early identification of at-riskness, that is, the notion that there should be some kind of way in which we screen kids to identify at risk. Now, the screening could be screening in an academic area, but if your focus is on dropout prevention, it might be focused more on the risk indicators of school dropout, which, of course, potentially would not be assessment data at all. The notion is that there would need to be some way in which progress is measured. So again, using the dropout example, if you're focused on attendance, that you would be monitoring over time. Typically, progress monitoring is done weekly or biweekly. You might be monitoring then over time, whatever you're doing. Let's say it's check and connect you're doing, that you might be monitoring whether in fact attendance is improving. And then this notion of interventions increasing in intensity. That is that if you find that whatever you're doing, that there's a population of kids that are really not responding to it, the notion that then there's going to be some additional level of intervention or intensity that's provided to respond to those to respond to those students who are not responding to what you're doing. And then this other point is this kind of relentless focus on data, which I think is a hallmark of RTI. So I've kind of walked you through what we then regarded as the kind of the key aspects of this RTI framework. If you think of it kind of more broadly at the high school level and perhaps more generically, the range of things we saw at the high school level. Christy's going to walk through a lot more examples than those that I gave you. So then these are the essential components: screening, progress monitoring, school-wide multi-level prevention system. I mean, typically we're always talking primary, secondary, tertiary. There are schools, although I would say this is more common at the elementary level, there are sometimes schools that have, or districts that have more than one secondary intervention they use. So it's not to suggest that it's always just three things that happen. But I think that the notion of primary, secondary, tertiary is primary what we do for all kids. Secondary is usually something that might be groups of kids. Tertiary very often is very intensive and might involve something you're doing one-on-one. And then this last point about the database decision-making. And the data, of course, is used initially to identify kids who are at risk, to identify whether kids are responding to whatever it is you're doing, which in turn then is used to move kids from tier to tier. The other part of this, I think that sometimes gets lost, is that it's potentially also an aspect of disability identification, because in the 2004 amendments to IDEA, response intervention is now used as one aspect of identification of kids with learning disabilities. Now, some caveats. I kind of mentioned at the beginning that there's a lot of research at the elementary level, particularly in reading. There's not so much research at the high school level, and that's in part kind of how we began this thing, is looking at what's out there. So a lot of the knowledge, we've extracted some information based on what we saw out there, but one important caveat is this is not very many schools that we visited, and we wouldn't want people to kind of overgeneralize from what we've seen. So a lot of the knowledge is kind of bubbling up from practice and from what schools are doing around the country. I think it's important to learn from that because it's about all we have to draw from now. But I do think that I guess I would add one important implication of that, and this reflects kind of a personal view I have, is that at the elementary level, where if you implement, the logic is that if you implement something that is research-based and you implement it with rigor, you can pretty much expect to achieve the outcomes or something approaching the outcomes the researchers achieved. One of the challenges I think that you'll have at the high school level is, since you don't have something that was necessarily validated in the first place, it's very important, in my view, that you be evaluating what you're implementing. That is, the data that you're collecting as you implement is going to be your best barometer as to whether you're implementing something that's effective. And I think that is one probably very big implication of kind of the state of the knowledge base. Some areas it's not quite so bad, like dropout prevention. We have things like Check and Connect that have been empirically validated, but in many areas, and a lot of the models we looked at had a literacy focus. And while there is some research to look at, the research on adolescent literacy is not that compelling in the sense of being confident that we have validated interventions. So with that as the important caveat, I'm going to turn it over to Christy now to begin talking about what RTI looks like in the high school settings.
So while Christy's getting set up, I'm going to hand over Tally for her. On your tables, you have notepads. As questions emerge, we have some natural pauses, but we want to be able to collect questions because they're often very similar types of questions. If you don't have a notepad, raise your hand and we'll divvy them out, but there should be stacks of them in the center of your table. So just start writing questions, and Jess will wander and collect them as we start to pause, and then we'll make sure that we answer them. And we're going to change seats up here because we like to make things fun and confusing. And it's the end of the day.
Musical chairs. Okay. All right, so I am going to talk a little bit about what RTI might look like in high school settings. As Lou said, these are examples of what we saw. They're not necessarily research-based, but they may be considered promising practices. Before I get into the actual implementation of the components, I want to talk about what we call establishing a focus or a goal. This is actually one of the contextual factors that we normally present at the end of the presentation, but for this particular presentation, I thought it would be useful to present up front because whatever a high school chooses as their focus really frames the way the essential components are implemented. So what we saw is that all the sites identified improving student achievement as a primary goal. Typically, they focused on 9th and 10th graders and usually English and or math, usually sometimes specifically algebra. But within that scope, they had various goals. For instance, one school chose to reduce D's and F's. They noticed that a lot of their students were making grades below C's, and they were worried that those students may drop out, may not graduate from high school, so that was one of their specific focus. Others initiated, they wanted to reduce the number of tardies because so many students were late to every class, they were losing instructional time. So there were various goals. And you can see for each of the contextual factors, we've developed a list of guiding questions that schools or districts can use to sort of plan and think about their implementation of RTI or tiered interventions. So these are some of the guiding questions that we developed and people are finding helpful. So first of all, simply, what is the purpose and scope of tiered interventions in your school? And how do existing initiatives fit into those tiered interventions? How do current special ed and instructional support practices align with tiered interventions, and so on? So the first thing that we're going to ask you to do is talk about what is your why? What is the primary need or area of concern in your school or in your district? It could be academics, it could be behavior, it could be both. You may want to focus in on one specific content area or attendance or grade levels. But we think it's really important before a school decides to undertake implementing RTI, which is no small task, that you're really clear on your focus. So individually at first, if you'll just jot down on a piece of scratch paper kind of a purpose statement and sort of complete the statement, RTI or tiered interventions will help my school or district to, and then whatever it is you want to work on. And then once you've jotted that down, you can turn to your neighbors and sort of share. And then we'll share out as a group so that all of the rest of you can hear what other places are kind of thinking that they'll do. So we'll take about 5 minutes and do that. I don't feel good sitting right here. Like I want to get up and yeah, I like to get up and walk. Okay, hopefully you've had some time to share. As we share out, we're going to jot down some of your ideas on the different areas of focus the schools have. So is there anyone who would like to begin? Wait time. Wait time. Is there anyone who wants to share what they were talking about, their table or plans that their schools have for the focus?
I'll just say probably the same thing that you've heard stood out is that I think there's a real need for RTI just to start looking at data, get a good focus on how we're looking, where we're continuously monitoring students as they're learning, and then what are we going to do with students that are in those 30-plus classroom sizes that are struggling as the classes continue to move on. And I think that's important. But the one thing I like about an RTI, just starting to bring it in and to work on it as a group, is that it keeps you focused on instruction, monitoring instruction, and assessments, and how important those are, because those are the things that are really lost in education today.
Right. So at the beginning of her response, she's talking about the continuous use of data and monitoring students, using that to inform instruction. That's kind of the gist of, yeah. Anyone else?
Attendance.
Attendance.
Yep.
Over here.
We're kind of set up this year to monitor academics, attendance / tardies, and behavior. With our academics, we tried a couple of things this year. We had interventions. The kids take the NWA, and they're told that, if you score between a certain area, you'll go to an intervention group. And there are yellow kids. And the yellow kids are pulled out. We have 85-minute blocks. So everybody is pulled out the first 15, 20 minutes. And during that time, the classroom teacher uses that time to review or to remediate students or anything that they missed on the NWA, anything that they have to push. And then when the class gets back together, then they present the new stuff. But it's almost kind of intervention for the whole group during the first 15, 20 minutes. And that's for academics. And for attendance, we monitor attendance. We have a homeschool facilitator, and that's his job, to make our attendance go up. So he comes up with a lot of different things. One of the things, we have like a principal's party during the middle of the day, unfortunately, for the kids that make it. And there are other incentives we do for the attendance. We have a tardy policy. There's an incentive if they get good attendance. Tardy. They make the tardy list of no tardies in a 6-week time, or 1 or 2 in a 6 weeks time. They get to go to the incentive. If not, when they get to, I'll say, we started so late, our kids had a lot of tardy, but once you get to 30, you can't come to school without a parent. and after about 3 or 4 times, parents aren't allowing their kids to be late. And for behavior, which, we went to a new system. We have incentives for behavior. We work on it with teachers and with students, but we have incentives that students go to if they meet the criteria for behavior.
Great. So lots of different goals for your school.
How about RTI being a professional development program for teachers that don't know how to teach? And I don't mean that negatively. What I mean is that most teacher training programs don't emphasize prevention, intervention, accommodations. So in essence, what you're doing is bringing your primary support staff to work in the regular or general education classroom and do it in the classroom so that you actually are developing the skills of the general education teacher. So RTI for me is professional development.
Yeah, that's a very interesting comment. That thought had crossed my mind several months ago, and we kind of had a discussion within our center about that, if anyone had ever tried that before. As far as I know, it's never been an official focus of RTI, but certainly something to consider that, may have good implications for schools. So, yeah. Okay, well, those are all some good goals, and we're going to move on now. I'm going to give you some specific examples. So the first essential component is screening. And what I'm going to do is talk about what we see kind of the typical implementation, usually in elementary schools, and then possible high school implementation. So typically in elementary schools, the purpose is to identify students who are at risk of poor learning outcomes. Now in high schools, that purpose is going to change because in high schools, there's no more waiting to see who is at risk. Like, the kids are behind, right? You know who is having the academic problems. So I'm going to go ahead and uncover this high school part, but really, RTI can still be considered a prevention model as it is in elementary school, except it's a little bit different in that in high school, instead of identifying students who are at risk of poor learning outcomes, you're pretty much identifying kids who are at risk of dropping out or not graduating. In elementary schools, typically it's done with all students. In high school, this could be a specific group of students that you're targeting. Again, depends on what your focus is. And as Lou alluded to earlier, you may not need to collect additional assessment data. By the time a student is in 9th or 10th grade, they have a whole trail of data behind them. And there's usually a pattern established of if a student's been having academic difficulties, you know who those students are. And you also have end-of-year tests. And the best predictor of how a student is going to do on the next end-of-year test is the previous end-of-year test. So really, and one thing we're finding in our middle school studies is that it may not be necessary to collect additional screening data, and don't add anything to your plates that you don't have to do. So various tools, again, in elementary school, there's the typical screening batteries. These are brief assessments that are valid and reliable, and they're predicting something. In high schools, again, ideally we would have something valid and reliable, but there are not a whole lot of tools designed for the high school level yet. But what we have seen is the early warning system tool, which the National High School Center has developed. And if you have questions about that, I think Jenny or Lou could answer them. Schools are looking at existing data from 8th grade. So if they're targeting 9th graders, they're looking at 8th grade data as they're coming in, and then they may give some kind of follow-up quick assessment once they get to 9th grade, just to make sure that they're identifying the right students for the intervention. Schools are also looking at multiple failures, which does have predictive validity for who may drop out. Attendance, tracking logs, those kinds of things. And again, the time frame on when you would administer these screening measures or look at data is going to vary. In elementary schools, you typically do the universal screening of fall, winter, and spring, but that's probably going to be different at high schools. So some specific examples that we saw, if a school was targeting reading, they may give some kind of curriculum-based measurement that's like a maze passage to measure comprehension. And this could be conducted at the end of 8th grade for the students feeding in. And then, as I mentioned, they might give another quick administration of that to new students, or they may do it for students they're kind of on the edge, they're not sure about. If the area of focus is just improving grades, so like the school that targeted students who are making D's and F's, they may pull past school data and look at students who have failed one or more content area classes, and that particular school reviewed that data 3 times a year. Another school looked at exit exams, and so if a student failed to pass the state exam on its first administration, that student was flagged. Behavior schools would tend to look at office discipline referrals. So those are just some examples of the different kinds of screening, how it looks so different from elementary school. So now we'll go on to progress monitoring. I don't see a whole lot of changes in this area between elementary and high school. You're still monitoring students' response to some sort of intervention. You can use this data to estimate their rates of improvement, identify the students that aren't making adequate progress, so their intervention, the intensity of it may need to be increased. And you can also use it to compare the efficacy of different forms of instruction that are going on in classrooms. And so, well, the screening data could possibly do that as well. But a lot of administrators can use that type of data to inform their professional development. If they notice that students across a grade level in one particular content area are performing not as well as expected, a specific piece of instruction, then that could inform their PD. Again, the students who receive progress monitoring are those identified either through the screening as needing interventions or those that are just receiving the interventions. The tools are, again, brief, valid, reliable, sensitive to small change. Some things we've seen are different diagnostic measures, curriculum-based measures, even class quizzes and tests, benchmark graduation tests, behavior tracking. And all the students are assessed at regular intervals, but it's, again, varies a little bit according to what your focus is at your school. So some specific examples. Now, we added in here primary instruction. Typically, like in elementary schools, you don't do formal progress monitoring on students who only receive primary intervention because those are the students who are not at risk. But we went ahead and added this in just to kind of emphasize that really, when you're implementing quality core instruction, there's still some level of monitoring going on. So even though ongoing formative assessment is not really progress monitoring, it's more assessment that occurs on the spot during instruction to inform the instruction right then and there. We saw a lot of that at the schools, and we'll talk more about that when we talk about core instruction, but that happens daily. A lot of the schools gave common math assessments or common writing prompts to all of their students monthly. Grades, attendance, just kind of general pieces of data to look at to make sure that during the course of a semester their students aren't encountering any kind of problems. But if they are, they're going to catch it, flag those students, and kind of target that student to find out what's going on. At the secondary level of intervention, we saw for schools that were doing algebra interventions, the teachers actually developed curriculum-based measurements that were tied to the state standards, and they would administer those approximately every other week, but it was kind of as they finished whatever section in their math book. And it was a really quick 5-10-minute assessment that they could do just to see if the students had mastered that particular objective. And for the students who hadn't, they would pull those kids aside, do a little quick reteach. They might work on that skill, that objective again for another day, and then they'd do another check to see if they'd mastered the objectives. So that was a nice way that they did that. Yes? Yeah, so in this school, they had, we'll talk about it a little bit more in the secondary, when I talk about secondary intervention, but they did their intervention through, it was a semester-long class, And they were all students who had failed algebra at least once before. So the instruction was a little bit slower paced, more systematic, more explicit, and they had 2 teachers in the room. So one teacher might have one group of kids, they're going on to the next objective. The other teacher would pull another group of kids together, another separate set of tables to reteach. In literacy classes, we saw maze passages, we saw kind of progress reports, time sampling for behavior, and in tertiary interventions, these were very intensive interventions, and the progress monitoring occurred daily. The kids were typically in a large class, but there might be 5 teachers in the room, and so really each teacher had a group of, say, 3 to 5 students, and they worked on basic literacy skills for an hour and a half. And they typically used the assessments that came with the intervention program they were using. So that's kind of how they kept track of those students. Any other questions before I go on to instruction? Okay. So primary prevention, again, the high-quality core instruction. This is an area of challenge for a lot of high schools because, what does research-based algebra instruction look like? And for schools who want to do RTI up through different content areas and do this in a science room, what does, research-based chemistry instruction look like? We don't know the answer to that. But we can talk a little bit about adolescent literacy. We can talk about effective instructional practices that can be done in any content area. So the first point I want to make is this triangle can be confusing to some people because it says 80% of students, but just a reminder for everybody that 80% means that potentially 80% of students, all their needs will be met through core instruction alone. But even if there is a special education student or a student receiving tertiary intervention, they should still be receiving core instruction. So here's just a quick rundown of what we saw. We saw explicit research-based instruction, standards-aligned instruction. Instruction was culturally responsive. There was scaffolding going on where the teachers knew exactly where kind of the level of support that students needed. So they did lots of formative assessment, quick checks of understanding, if not, reteach real fast, differentiated instruction, clear behavior expectations for those schools who were implementing some sort of PBIS type framework. And then we noticed a lot of what we call academic literacy, where even in science and social studies and economics classes, literacy practices were brought into those classrooms. And so that really helps students who might have some difficulties reading the textbooks that gave them some strategies to use to help them access the actual content. So that's a big one for a lot of schools. Okay, secondary and tertiary prevention. Again, secondary, for example, a lot of schools conceptualize that as tier 2. Those are evidence-based interventions of moderate intensity. Some people call them just supplemental interventions. And these are provided in addition to the core. They are typically teacher-led small group instruction, and there's ongoing progress monitoring and appropriate diagnostic as needed. Whereas in tertiary, which is often tier 3, these are very intensive interventions, individualized for students who show minimal response to secondary. Now, I will say, usually in elementary schools, the flow of RTI goes that, everyone receives primary, the struggling students go to secondary, and then if they don't respond to secondary, they go to tertiary. I'm here to tell you that it is okay if you have students in high school who are 3, 4, 5 years below grade level, it is okay for them to go straight to tertiary. The research that we've been doing in middle schools shows that even, 6th grade students who are going to be less behind than, say, a 10th grader might be behind their peers, that secondary prevention is usually not enough for those kids. So by the time they get to high school and they're far behind, they can catch up, but it takes a very intensive intervention. And what I mean by that is 5 days a week, 2 hours a day, group size, 1-on-1 or 1 to 3. So I don't want people to think that they have to follow this script of secondary in order to go to tertiary. So I kind of just went over this. It's, again, in addition to primary, very small group size, daily, almost daily progress monitoring, and very intense intervention. So here's some examples of the secondary prevention that we saw. English language arts. So the way usually these were structured as classes. So it's not, we're in elementary school, they might have a little block of time before they go to recess, and you can pull them out in the hallway and do a 30-minute intervention. These were actual classes that lasted a semester. They were 55 minutes, 5 days a week. And so in the English language arts area, they concentrated on more basic skills, like, not that these are basic, but vocabulary, comprehension, strategy, instruction. So giving them things to use like graphic organizers, explicit instruction on how to summarize and find main idea. For vocabulary, working on generative vocabulary, such as learning root words and how to generate their own meaning from words, but also additive vocabulary so that they increase their vocabulary. A lot of the teachers collaborated together, so if they knew this group of students was going to be working on a unit on World War I, they might preview some of those words that the history teachers were going to do. They worked on fundamentals of writing and some just basic study skills that they could then take to their other classes and translate there and generalize. They were typically a large group, just like a regular class size, but they would do small group work and pairs work in order to give the students more opportunities to respond. The instruction was explicit and systematic when they were teaching them certain strategies. And again, they had ongoing formative assessment, journal checks. They would do daily writing samples, and the teacher would check them daily. Algebra, again, the same thing. It was a class period. They typically did pre-teaching and reteaching of concepts from their core algebra class. And so again, they had the small groups within the large group instruction, with the explicit systematic instruction on certain, objectives within the algebra curriculum. Frequent feedback, and the teacher-developed curriculum-based measurements organized around the state standards to monitor how students were learning. And for behavior, there were actually behavior intervention classes, 40 minutes a day. Their content might be, for example, check and connect. The school focused on creating a positive learning environment, posting those behavioral expectations, and then they monitored the students by looking at their office discipline referrals and their grades. Tertiary, I believe the only area we saw tertiary intervention was English language arts or reading. And these students were in 9th and 10th grade and were reading somewhere between like a 4th and an 8th grade level. They were using an intervention program. Again, there might be group size of 4 students. So within the classroom, there were 5 teachers. They were focusing on really basic reading skills like phonics, fluency, and then translating that to comprehension. But the main focus was word study or advanced word study. So I think I've kind of described that. Are there any questions on interventions? Yeah.
What type of schedule did the school set up, and what was the philosophy centered around the whole child? And is it strictly naturally that they're getting into the status, or what are other expectations for the rest of the business?
That's a great question, and I'm going to jump in and say that one of the contextual factors that we talk about is actually all around scheduling, and it addresses that, and we're going to get to that in just a few moments, so we're going to come back to that, so I'm going to put that one on the side burner for now. Other questions?
For
people to provide these Tier 3 interventions?
Absolutely. Definitely. Not every school is going to be able to implement it the way these schools did. I would say that for some of the schools, they had to shift the roles of their staff. So they might be using school counselors to provide some of the interventions, school psychologists.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
Okay. And I think that's where the focus becomes really important. So if your focus isn't necessarily on, say, math, for example, you want to make sure that you're aligning your staff with your focus. So when we've given this presentation, other presentations, people say, well, we don't have the staff to do this in behavior, math, and reading. Well, you need to look at your data and determine where your focus is. And we acknowledge that it is a staffing issue, and that's it's one of the contextual factors is all around staffing. And the reason for that is we know that it requires some different ways of thinking about staffing. And all the schools that we visited talked about having to prioritize stuff. So we're going to do a time check and keep going.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Have you ever run into the problem where you have to have one-on-one focus where you have a team and math and literacy?
And those schools that have, they're literally looking at it more as a continuous school improvement. So repeating the question for the audio so that it's what about schools that have multiple focus areas? And they really end up saying, based on our data right now suggests that we don't know what instructional area to focus because students aren't in classes. So we're first going to take care and come up with different tiered interventions and screening and progress monitoring measures all around attendance. And then they were going back and saying, now that we have students in classes for longer, we're going to look at our instructional aspect. And it also, in terms of choosing between, for instance, two kind of focus areas of academic, a lot of that was aligning with district priorities and other initiatives that were coming through either through the district or the state and other. So it's really that leveraging that aspect and where the strength was in terms of if there was one almost department that was more willing to go for it first and starting with that and then expanding into those others as they had the data to show that there was improvement.
Yes.
Just a comment as I listen.
We've got the mic behind you.
Just a comment as I listen to some of the concerns that I've heard addressed and the way a couple schools in my state have addressed the issue. The concern was brought up: how do we get the teachers and make the HR resources available to staff the intervention period? We had a high school that recognized two focuses. One, credit recovery for students that at some point had needed that for graduation. And the second was students that were struggling in a class, as identified by a D or an F on a report card grade from the previous quarter, or lacked the organizational skills to be successful, such as incoming sophomores. And the unique situation that they did was they just added a little bit of time to their lunch period and created like a 55-minute lunch period. And then any of those students identified as struggling in a class or students seeking extra help, they had 20 to 25 minutes they could go with the teacher. They could go meet with the teacher in that particular area. To overcome the HR issue involved with that, what they did that I thought was just fantastic was they created, like at the university, the teachers would have office hours. There were certain days that certain teachers would be available for that. And the way they sold that to their staff to manage the union issue was they said this: look, you are guaranteed a 25-minute lunch. Okay, you're guaranteed that. We're going to give you that 25-minute lunch every day. However, we're going to ask you to do the tutoring, and in exchange for that, you're going to get a 30-minute lunch 2 to 3 days, or you're going to get a 55-minute lunch 2 to 3 days a week. So the teachers are actually getting a longer lunch period some of the days to get them with some of that buy-in. But then they had the students available. And the unique thing we found out when we analyzed the data from that high school is this: a lot of the AP kids in AP classes and honor classes and concurrent enrollment classes, they were taking advantage of that office hour time for small group learning with their teacher to get caught up and made up. And then the teachers had the flexibility of saying, if you're absent from my class, the first when you come back, you're required to be to my office hours at the very next available time. So those are some of the unique ways that they handled that for the student intervention. For the credit recovery, they actually went in and created an elective class for students that met certain criteria, so that they're actually demonstrated that they're getting their mindset back in gear to be successful in high school. They actually had an elective class assigned to them where they went to the elective class, and the whole point and purpose of the class was to work on a packet or an online program that was designed for credit recovery, and that had flexible entry-exit times. So you could be entered into that at any point of the year, and then when you completed what you had entered in for, you could be exited out of the class. So that's some unique ways that a couple schools in my state have managed the HR issue.
Yeah, and I think that's what schools have to do. They have to be really creative and think outside the box. So what state are you from? Utah. Utah. Love Utah. Great. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, I'm going to go through this next one real quick, even though it's very, very important. It's really the heart of RTI, database decision making. This is, again, just using screening and progress monitoring data to make informed decisions. And typically those decisions fall into three areas: either to improve instruction, to move students within the multi-level prevention system, or disability identification. And in high school, really don't see anything regarding disability identification. Typically, students who have disabilities have been identified before they get to high school, but there might be cases every once in a while where that may apply. But basically, teachers are using the progress monitoring to really lead their intervention work. Because students are, quote, stuck in an intervention class for an entire semester, they have to wait until the end of that semester to exit. But if the teacher realized that a student was catching up or, exceeding their expectations, had reached their goal before the semester was up, they didn't just keep doing the same thing over and over. The teacher actually sought out new materials to teach to their level. Data is reviewed during department and professional learning community meetings to, again, inform their professional development. Schools had data days where they would look at school-wide data. And one interesting part is the level of student involvement in high school, which is very different from elementary school. That by the time a student is in high school, they can really have a say in their education and have input into the kind of intervention they're getting and being able to monitor their own learning and their own progress. So we saw that. All right, we're going to give you some time to talk at your tables now. I know that so many of you are working in these areas and you have different challenges and things that you want to talk about with other people. So the kind of discussion prompts are, from your perspective, what do you see as the potential benefits to implementing RTI or tiered interventions in a high school? And what are the potential barriers, pitfalls, or challenges? So go ahead and you can talk with your neighbors about that. And if we have time, we'll share out a little bit. We're supposed to start at 1:15, so it should be done at 2:45. So we've got like 25 minutes. Okay. That's good.
Yeah. To share. Well, and I'm going to tell Jess, I'm going to circulate and have people write them down, because I think if we get them written down. Okay.
Some of them, and even the comments, they go more with stuff
We're talking about, and that's the heart. Mm-hmm. One of the many things that's fun about this. Is it you? I was like, what is email?
Yeah, what it is it's set up for emails, but I don't know what it is.
Okay, that's fine. I just keep looking around like, all right.
I can actually.
No, you don't have to. It's just more of like I felt like some alarm was going off. I'm like, And I wanted to make sure if something was like, if you're getting called, I was like, okay, I want to make sure that you need to be called. That's fine. Or either of you. It was just more like something's going on. If we know about it, that's fine.
I don't get email on my phone.
Oh, you know?
Mm-mm. Actually, I tried to set it up, but I couldn't. I think UT has some kind of strange server,
Uh-huh.
and I don't have like a BlackBerry or a iPhone. It's just like a regular phone.
Yeah. I had first got a BlackBerry when I was in the department, and I thought I had died and gone to heaven because
Really?
Oh, it was so great. It wasn't just doing the email. The thing that was really great was to have my schedule.
Oh.
Because before the BlackBerry, I used to have a paper calendar.
Right.
And I didn't see the point of Outlook because I'd almost have to be in my office to see it. So,
Right.
I had to have, and I always, my paper calendar always had to be in the office so people could put stuff on my calendar. So I often didn't know where I was supposed to be. And so then when I got to BlackBerry, it was like, and it wasn't just that I had it with me. It changed instantaneously. So if somebody took something off my calendar in the office, it was off my BlackBerry. It was just,
Right.
Is this nightmare scheduling?
no, just saying that when I first got a BlackBerry in the department,
He was very happy.
and it was
I don't
more
know.
the calendar than it was the email.
See, because it's my personal one, and so I don't have the calendar, and I kind of want to know it.
Yeah. No, but for me it was great because I would find myself, I once flew into Dallas and I realized I didn't know the hotel I was going to.
Oh, see, yeah.
It was on my calendar back at work
Yep.
because I never took my calendar with me so people could put stuff on
Yep.
the calendar. And I tried to keep a duplicate calendar.
But then it's never
right.
updated.
Yeah, they were never right. And so once I got a BlackBerry, it was like usually when I was on hand, I could look and see
Say, where am I going?
and it might actually have the confirmation number for the hotel and stuff like that. It was good.
That I send it to myself, so it's on there. It's because if I I often will send from work an invitation to my personal calendar, which then gets on my BlackBerry, and so that way I have it.
We're good?
Yeah, let's
Okay. All right, let's go ahead and bring it back together. Hopefully you had some good discussions. I'm actually going to wait to take comments right now because we're going to go through the contextual factors, and some of that may answer some of the questions you have or some of the challenges that you're experiencing.
So in the meantime, just write them down on pieces of paper.
Yes.
We'll keep collecting those and make sure that we answer them.
Yes. And I also want to mention some additional resources for the essential components that I just went through. The National Center on RTI has a progress monitoring tools chart and screening tools chart, and it tells you what area that it focuses on, what grade levels, so that's a resource you can use. The National High School Center website has the early warning system tool, which is a good screener. And if you need more assistance with instruction, the Center on Instruction website has tons of resources on adolescent literacy, bringing literacy into content areas, instructional practices for students with disabilities, math, science. So those are some good resources you can use. All right. The contextual factors unique to RTI, we've already talked about focus. And we identified these because as we had conversations with schools, several themes kept emerging that these contextual factors really shaped how they would be able to implement the logistics of the essential components. These contextual factors, they interact with each other, but they also interact with the actual implementation of RTI. So you all voted on which ones were of highest importance to you, and the ones that won were school culture, instructional organization, and implementation and alignment. So those are the three we'll cover, and then we'll give you some time to talk about the others. On your tables, there is actually a worksheet on the contextual factors. This is a little activity that we developed. You can use this back at your schools to lead, some kind of leadership meeting, to plan for RTI, or use it in staff development. But you can use that as I talk right now about these, and then you can use that also to talk with your table partners. All right, so school culture. School culture really speaks to the current beliefs, practices that schools have. Every school has a unique history, and the way that RTI can be implemented in a school completely depends on the culture of that school. There are some schools that are more resistant to change. There are others that tend to embrace innovation and like change. It all depends on the history of the leadership, the teachers, if there's a lot of staff turnover, et cetera. It's really the attitudes of the school. So some of the guiding questions here: in what ways do those current beliefs, practices, behaviors align with the goals and purposes for the tiered intervention framework? Where did the motivation for adopting the framework originate, and how might that affect staff buy-in? So that kind of gets back again to your focus. If your staff can really buy into the focus, and they've all agreed that this is a problem for the school and they want to fix it, that's a good buy-in mechanism, if you will. How do current prevention efforts map onto a tiered framework? What changes might be required for staff members to collaborate, examine student data, and act on what they learn from those data? So it's really talking about working together to solve problems. What changes might be required to ensure that the needs of all students are addressed? So some examples from the site visits. There was actually one school who, what they found out when they started implementing RTI was that there was this synergy between their own beliefs and philosophy at their school and sort of the language of RTI, or the purpose of RTI. And so for them, RTI was a great fit. There were other schools where that was not the case. So that's just kind of one of the examples of how a school had to either embrace their culture to implement RTI, or other schools might have to work through some issues before they're able to put all the pieces into place. Another school really liked using small learning communities, and they used those to facilitate connections between the students and the teachers. And it was a very large high school, and it made it feel smaller for a lot of those students. It really took their interests into mind. It was very motivating for the students. And so that's how they were able to kind of embrace their students, and it was one of their strategies for sort of monitoring those students' progress across the whole school. So there'd be like a little mother hen for these students that they knew they could always come to and ask for help. So I'm going to stop there, and if there's anything that someone wants to speak to regarding culture, things you're experiencing.
Well, I'm going to suggest that we do a little bit more tabletop time right now, and then after the last one, we'll do more of a larger report out.
Okay.
So let's just do some tabletop, a few minutes just to talk about the culture that you have in your school or in your district, and whether or not you think that it embraces some of the essential components that we've talked about, or aspects that you think would need to be changed.
Anything you want to add in, or?
I think we can kind of refer I don't know that we need to go to each of the questions on the going questions. We can just say that get more time for some of them. That will allow us to report out. In case they're taking pictures, that you're not listed as Lou.
And vice versa.
And vice versa.
I feel like there's not that much to say.
There's not, and that's why we fly through those. And that's why I said that's just different time. Like, for the one that we're going to need to spend more time on is the instructional, the schedule.
And you're going to have to look at like school scheduling. I'm like,
Do you want me to do it?
sure.
All right, we're going to pull you back together. Make sure you're writing down questions as you have them. And I get to talk about the organizational or instructional organization, which is often just known as scheduling. All right, so really what it comes down to, I'm going to skip the guiding questions. You have those in your handout on scheduling, and we're going to go to the next slide, if you don't mind, and really talk about what we saw. So what we saw in the high schools really depended on a few things. We have seen and visited schools that were using traditional 6 to 8 period schedules daily, and we also went to schools that were doing some block configurations. We saw hybrid schools as well, that they had block schedules on some days and more of the traditional every class the other day. In talking to several principals at several different schools, we ended up starting to talk to them about their schedule, how they came up with it, and if they had actually ever thought about switching. We often hear a lot of people saying, well, if only we had a block schedule, it would be easier. Or if only we had more of a traditional schedule, it would be easier, because then there are benefits of both. And the principals that we've talked to, and by now, this is not just talking about some of the schools that Christy and Lou have been talking about, but we've talked to high schools all over the country. A lot of them, we've been asking them this question, and they say, not really. And the reason for that is it ultimately comes down to this. The school schedule that a school has at that moment, administrators know how to tweak, or for better words, really get the most out of their time. And one principal said, I don't want to change because I can manipulate this schedule so that students get additional instructional time, and that's what we're talking about. Not necessarily having to go and change schedules, knowing that that causes a real disruption in terms of what's going on. So with that frame in mind, when we talk to different schools, every school obviously has someone who's in charge of the master schedule. This plays a role for the district folks in the room. A lot of district folks can start to help collecting different schedules, helping to organize that, and giving administrators examples of how other schools have done this, and have some conversations within the district around this. Schools that are in more of a using traditional periods, 6 to 8 periods, really ends up being 2 different times and ways that people were adding on the additional interventions. One was that study hall, how we knew it, no longer exists. It's much more of a guided time. This is when students were receiving additional interventions. They were regrouped. They went to one place for attendance check-in, and then went to a different room where they were getting their additional interventions. So they were really using that time. Either students moved, or students were assigned for an entire study hall, a different room, and that teacher would change based on kind of the content that needed to be done. And then those teachers, through different mechanisms that the school had in place, were able to then group students based on what skills they needed, and to do additional small groups of tier 2, or that secondary level of prevention, during study hall time. So that was one way. Another way is that schools were just saying, especially for students who are really far behind, they said we had to have a really hard decision and make a decision in our school of what we were going to do, which speaks to your question in the back around how did they do this, and really that challenge around the whole child, and how do we make sure that they still get those electives, because oftentimes that's what keeps students coming back, especially at the high school level. They said we knew all of that, and ultimately we decided to pull students out of electives. Now, how they did this, though, some schools had really interesting way of doing it. So in some schools, they did all of their content classes in the morning and all of the electives in the afternoon. And by doing that, they were able to then say students were scheduled in electives, and then they got pulled out of electives as they needed them. And for those tier 2 student, once they got caught up, they went back into their elective. And they had discussions about how there were pluses and minuses for that. But that's generally what we saw in terms of schools that were on the traditional 6 to 8 period schedules. For schools that were more on 4x4 blocks, every other day there was a seminar day, and they were using that time for their interventions in different ways. And how they did that really depended on the school's focus. One school was focused entirely on math. They knew that they, school-wide, they were able to pick out where their deficiency were. And the math department got together and basically created their own curriculum throughout the year. They had a problem of the week that every teacher gave out during that seminar time. The math department also then video recorded themselves teaching the lesson so that the content area teachers that weren't mathematicians were able to see how it was delivered. The department also came up with frequently made mistakes and solutions and pointers around that. Well, the students that needed the secondary and tertiary level supports were in the seminar time with math teachers. So as those students that didn't necessarily need the additional support were in classes that were non-math teachers. So they were able to use their seminar time. That's one example. Other examples, they just put students into actual programs or additional intervention programs during this time. So in terms of block schedules, they were really using that seminar time every other day to get that additional support. In some schools during this time, the administrators, students weren't assigned to any location. It was a free time for students. The administrators opened up the cafeteria, and the administrators staffed the cafeteria every other day during this time so that the content teachers could deliver the interventions. We asked the administrators about it. They said, well, we're not teachers of this content. We want those teachers to be able to provide the intervention. What we can do is make sure that the cafeteria is managed. And so that's what they did. And other places did other variations on that is really what it came down to. And that might have been the fastest that I've ever done the scheduling before in my life. There's more information in the publication that we're going to have. And if you have other questions on the scheduling, please feel free to come up and ask. We know it's an issue. We know it's a challenge. But we've heard from enough principals that say we're able to make it work regardless of what. There is no best schedule for really implementing tiered interventions. It's knowing how to really manipulate what you've got.
And along those same lines, I think that flows into this this third one about implementation and alignment, which really speaks to not reinventing the wheel. A lot of schools have various grants and initiatives going on, and the last thing you want to do is add yet another layer, another thing for your teachers to do. But usually if you kind of examine all the initiatives you have going on, you can align them to meet the same goal, or one supplements one goal, another supplements another one. So you have the guiding questions. And a few things we saw were the schools coordinating these initiatives. So as we spoke about earlier, defining your focus, some schools wanted to tackle behavior and academics, but they chose behavior first. And so first they implemented a PBIS type framework. Once they felt that they had that under control, then they would gradually add in more academics. Other schools had advancement via individual determination, or AVID, going on, and that was working really well for their school, and they saw how that could fit into their RTI framework. Other schools were doing check and connect, and that helps with their PBIS. So those are just some examples of how schools really worked with what they already had to help implement some other kind of tiered interventions framework. Other resources, staff roles, of course, we already mentioned this is a big one. And a lot of these staff had to be used in different ways. So first they had to kind of find someone to lead this implementation of RTI. Sometimes that fell to the school psychologist or the counselors. Other times where literacy was the focus, they made sure that the literacy coaches had time to be really involved with the process of implementing RTI, so that person would kind of drive the instructional change. For one school that was worried about tardies, they involved their security staff, and their security staff would walk through the hallways about a few minutes before the students were supposed to be in class and do a sweep. And so that helped them get their kids into class on time. Professional development. So someone earlier in the day mentioned investing in staff versus equipment. That's what we saw at these schools too. They had to make priorities. For a lot of the schools, they chose PD. They wanted to invest in their staff and do more PD. The teachers wanted more time to plan, and so at one school, they actually started their school day late a few times, so the teachers had that planning time with no students there. staff meetings were used differently in the past, where they had talked about logistics and ordering books and field trips and whatever. They instead pushed that aside. That's for a different meeting. This meeting is to talk about instruction and our students and getting them to make gains. Space, so classroom space, there may not be enough time or enough space for an intervention, so they chose to use a conference space that had previously been used for parent conferences, which that space was not used all the time, so that was a perfect space for interventions. So those are some examples. As you said earlier, the other contextual factors are in your worksheet. We have the documents to pass out to you. I also have some of the Center on Instruction e-catalogs, which is a listing of all of our resources to help with instruction. So I think now we're going to
do some table talk.
Take time to talk. Go ahead. We're going to use the rest of the time. I think we have about 5 minutes to talk at your tables about the other contextual factors or anything else you want to network together, and we'll pass out the other resources so that you can get out of here in a timely manner.
So in 5 minutes, we'll do a quick report out on any pressing materials, questions, things like that. If you have other questions, we'll collect those, and then we'll answer those as well. So look at the contextual factors worksheet. That'll be in each of your tables, and see if you have any additional questions about that.